At Brookfield General Hospital, Dr. Simone Carter and Dr. Daniel Carter, two respected physicians, face an unthinkable confrontation when a security guard questions their very presence in a place they've dedicated their lives to. What begins as a painful moment of discrimination quickly sets off a ripple effect, forcing the hospital to confront its culture of bias and redefine what inclusivity truly means. As tensions rise, unlikely allies emerge, and deep introspection leads to surprising growth. Can a fractured trust be rebuilt? And will the people involved rise to the challenge of lasting change? Follow this compelling journey of resilience, accountability, and hope as the Carters, the hospital staff, and even those who once resisted, navigate the road to healing. Brookfield General Hospital was a hive of activity on a brisk Monday morning. Ambulances came and went, delivering patients through sliding doors that never seemed to stop moving. Doctors and nurses navigated the bustling halls, their steps brisk and purposeful. Among them were Dr. Simone Carter and her husband, Dr. Daniel Carter, two of the most respected physicians in the region. Their names were well known in medical circles, synonymous with excellence and compassion. Simone, a poised woman in her late 30s, wore her white coat over a crisp blue blouse. Her hair was styled into a neat bun, and her expression carried the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating the demanding world of cardiology. Beside her, Daniel's tall frame exuded a calm authority. His navy scrubs contrasted with his warm, approachable smile, a smile that often put his patients at ease, even in the face of dire diagnoses. Their morning had started like any other. Simone had kissed their two young daughters goodbyes before dropping them off at school, while Daniel had made coffee for both of them. Their modest suburban home was cozy, with walls adorned with family photos and children's art. It was a sanctuary from the demanding lives they led at the hospital. Now, stepping into the hospital's polished marble lobby, Simone and Daniel exchanged a glance as they prepared to head to their respective departments. "Big day?" Daniel asked, adjusting his badge. Simone nodded. "I have the cardiology conference this morning. They want to hear about the new trial data." Daniel gave her a playful grin. "Knock them dead." Simone rolled her eyes but smiled. "How about you?" "Neurosurgery back-to-back," he replied. "A full plate." They were about to part ways when a firm voice called out, stopping them in their tracks. "Excuse me." They turned to see a security guard striding toward them. Greg Larson, a stocky man in his mid-40s with closely cropped hair and a no-nonsense expression, squared his shoulders as he approached. "Can I see some identification?" he asked, his tone curt. Simone blinked in surprise. "Our badges are right here," she said, gesturing to the hospital IDs clipped to their coats. Greg frowned, his gaze scrutinizing them. "What are you doing here?" Daniel's brow furrowed. "We work here. I am Dr. Carter, neurosurgery. This is Dr. Simone Carter, cardiology." Greg's expression remained skeptical. He folded his arms and glanced around, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby staff and patients. "You're telling me you are both doctors here?" Simone's cheeks flushed. She was no stranger to dismissive looks or doubting glances, but the public nature of this confrontation stung. "Yes, we are," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "I need you to step aside," Greg said, his hand resting on his radio. "You shouldn't be wandering in unauthorized areas." By now, people were watching. Whispers rippled through the lobby, their words muffled, but their curiosity unmistakable. Daniel took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm. "This is unacceptable. We are physicians here, and you are creating an unnecessary scene." Greg's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, a nurse hurried over, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Dr. Carter," she said, addressing Simone. "Is everything all right?" Simone glanced at the nurse and nodded faintly. "It will be." The nurse turned to Greg, her tone sharp. "They are senior physicians here. You cannot treat them like this." Greg blinked, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He stepped back slightly, muttering, "Just doing my job." Simone and Daniel didn't wait for further explanation. Simone touched Daniel's arm, signaling him to let it go for now. Together, they walked toward the elevator, their heads held high. Inside the elevator, the tension between them was palpable. Daniel stared at the floor, his jaw tight, while Simone folded her arms, her fingers gripping her elbows. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked softly. Simone nodded but didn't speak immediately. When she finally did, her voice was steady but tinged with frustration. "I am tired of this, Daniel. We should not have to prove ourselves over and over again." "I know," he said, exhaling. "But what can we do? These things don't change overnight." Simone turned to him, her eyes fierce. "We have to try. If we don't speak up, nothing changes." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, what do you want to do?" Simone pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I am calling Rachel." Dr. Rachel Edwards, the chief medical officer of Brookfield General, was in her office when Simone's call came through. Her desk was cluttered with reports and schedules, but she pushed them aside when she saw Simone's name. "Simone," she said, answering the call. "What's going on?" Simone explained the situation succinctly, her voice calm but firm. Rachel listened intently, her brow furrowing as the details unfolded. "I am so sorry this happened," Rachel said. "I will look into it immediately." "I need more than an apology, Rachel," Simone said. "This is not just about us. It is about what this represents. If it can happen to us, what about others who don't have our credentials?" Rachel nodded, though Simone couldn't see her. "You are absolutely right. Let me address this. I will set up a meeting with Greg, hospital administration, and both of you. We need to get to the root of this." "Thank you," Simone said. After hanging up, Rachel leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. As a leader, she prided herself on fostering a culture of inclusivity, but this incident revealed cracks in the system she thought was solid. She picked up the phone and dialed Greg's supervisor. "We need to talk about one of your guards," she said. That evening, Simone and Daniel sat in their living room, the warmth of their home offering some comfort after a difficult day. Their daughters, Mia and Layla, played quietly in the corner with their building blocks, their laughter a soothing counterpoint to the tension still lingering in the air. Simone sipped her tea, her eyes distant. "Do you think it will make a difference?" she asked. Daniel set down his mug. "Rachel is on our side. She will take this seriously." Simone glanced at him, her gaze softening. "I hope so. I just want to believe that things can change." "They can," Daniel said, reaching for her hand. "But it is going to take time." Simone squeezed his hand, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her chest. She thought about Greg's face, the mixture of doubt and defiance in his eyes, and wondered what it would take to make someone like him see the harm in his actions. Outside, the evening settled over their quiet neighborhood, the stars beginning to dot the sky. Simone looked at her daughters, their innocence untouched by the weight of the world, and silently resolved to fight for a future where they would never have to endure what she and Daniel had faced. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. Daniel nodded, his voice steady. "Then let us make sure it is a good one." The next morning, Brookfield General hummed with its usual energy, the rhythms of care and crisis creating a unique symphony. Doctors consulted with patients, nurses monitored vital signs, and families waited anxiously for updates. Yet beneath the surface, whispers about the previous day's confrontation began to circulate among staff. Simone Carter stood in her office, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across her organized workspace. Despite the professional calm she exuded in the hospital hallways, her mind churned with frustration. Daniel entered, closing the door softly behind him. He wore his navy scrubs and carried a patient file, though his focus was entirely on his wife. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked gently. Simone turned, her expression firm. "Of course I am. That man humiliated us, Daniel. And not just us, it was a message to everyone watching. We were nothing more than intruders to him." Daniel set the file down on a side table and crossed the room to stand by her. "I know. Believe me, I know. But it feels like we've been here before, doesn't it? You remember the conference in Boston?" Simone sighed, recalling the incident. They had been mistaken for caterers at a medical symposium where both were keynote speakers. The sting of that experience still lingered, a reminder of the quiet battles they faced even at the heights of their careers. "I remember," she said. And I also remember letting it go, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But where has that gotten us? Yesterday, we were treated like we didn't belong in a place we've dedicated our lives to. I won't let this slide. Daniel leaned against the desk, studying her. I know why you're upset. I am too. But we both know how these things go. Greg will say he was doing his job, and people will call it a misunderstanding. What do we accomplish by pushing back? Simone's eyes hardened. Accountability. If nothing else, we show that this behavior has consequences. Maybe the next person won't have to deal with what we did. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Dr. Rachel Edwards. She stepped inside, her expression composed but tinged with concern. "Good morning," Rachel said, offering a small smile. "Do you have a minute to talk?" Simone nodded, gesturing to the chairs near the desk. Rachel settled into one, her beige blazer impeccably pressed, her posture signaling the seriousness of the discussion. "I spoke to Greg's supervisor last night," Rachel began. "I also reviewed the security footage. Simone, Daniel, you were absolutely in the right to bring this to my attention. What happened was unacceptable." Simone sat down, her arms crossed. "What will you do about it?" Rachel hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've scheduled a meeting with Greg, his supervisor, hospital administration, and both of you. It's important we address this transparently, but I also want to approach it constructively. This isn't just about Greg, it's about the culture we're fostering here." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Rachel, with all due respect, he embarrassed us in front of half the lobby. Are you saying this is just a teachable moment for him?" Rachel held his gaze. "I'm saying this is a chance to set a precedent. If we handle this right, it can be the start of meaningful change, not just a disciplinary note in a file." Simone's posture softened slightly. "When is the meeting?" "This afternoon," Rachel said. "I want to hear from everyone involved, but I also want to be clear Brookfield General does not tolerate bias, overt or implicit. I'll do everything in my power to ensure that message is clear." Simone nodded, her resolve steady. "Then we'll be there." Meanwhile, in a cramped security office on the ground floor, Greg Larson leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His co-worker, Lee Nguyen, sat at a desk nearby, flipping through paperwork, but stealing occasional glances at Greg. "They called me in for a meeting," Greg muttered. Apparently, the doctors complained to Edwards. Lisa hesitated before responding. "Greg, I've been meaning to ask. Do you really think they were suspicious? I mean, they had badges. They looked like they belonged here." Greg scoffed. "It's not about how they looked. It's about following protocol. I can't just let anyone wander around the hospital, badge or not." Lisa set her pen down and turned to him. "But they weren't wandering. They were just walking to their departments like everyone else. Do you ever think you might have?" "I don't know. Jump to conclusions?" Greg's expression darkened. "What are you saying? That I'm biased? Come on, Lisa. I've been doing this job for years. I know when something feels off." Lisa sighed, sensing the futility of pushing further. "Just be careful in the meeting. Rachel Edwards isn't someone you can bluff your way past." The meeting room was quiet when Simone and Daniel arrived. Rachel greeted them with a nod, and they took seats at the long conference table. Moments later, Greg entered, followed by his supervisor and a hospital administrator. Greg's steps faltered when he saw the Carters, but he quickly composed himself, his expression unreadable. Rachel opened the meeting with a direct tone. "We're here to discuss the incident that occurred yesterday morning. Dr. Simone Carter and Dr. Daniel Carter, thank you for joining us. Greg, I'd like to start by hearing your account of what happened." Greg straightened, his tone measured. "I noticed the Carters in the lobby and didn't recognize them. They seemed out of place. My job is to ensure the safety of the hospital, so I asked for their identification." "Out of place," Simone repeated, her voice calm but sharp. "What exactly about us seemed out of place?" Greg hesitated, glancing at Rachel for support, but found none. "I just mean, I wasn't familiar with them. I didn't want to take any chances." Rachel interjected, her tone firm. "Greg, the Carters are senior physicians here. They had visible identification and were conducting themselves professionally. Your actions were not only unwarranted, but deeply disrespectful." Simone leaned forward, her voice steady. Do you realize how humiliating it was to be accused in front of our colleagues and patients? We've dedicated our lives to this hospital. Your assumptions undermined everything we've worked for. Greg's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Rachel glanced around the table. This isn't just about one incident. It's a symptom of a larger issue. If someone as respected as the Carters can be treated this way, what does that say about how we treat others who come through these doors? The hospital administrator nodded. This is serious. We need to address the underlying culture that allowed this to happen. Rachel turned back to Greg. Effective immediately, you will be placed on probation. Additionally, you'll be required to attend bias training sessions, which we're implementing hospital-wide. Greg's face reddened, but he nodded stiffly. Understood. The meeting ended with a tense silence. As Simone and Daniel left, Rachel walked them to the elevator. I know this doesn't fix everything, Rachel said quietly, but it's a start. Simone looked at her friend, her expression unreadable. We'll see, Rachel. We'll see. As the elevator doors closed, Simone leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's not enough, she murmured. It's a step, Daniel replied. And sometimes that's where change begins. The quiet of the elevator felt heavier than usual as Simone and Daniel rode down to the hospital's main floor. Simone stared at the numbers above the doors, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Daniel stood beside her, leaning against the rail, his expression thoughtful but subdued. You think he even heard us? Daniel asked, breaking the silence. Simone glanced at him, her jaw tightening. Maybe, maybe not. But that's not the point. We spoke up. We made it clear this won't be brushed under the rug. Daniel nodded, though his skepticism lingered. I just wonder if Rachel's measures will stick. A few training sessions won't change years of assumptions. Simone's lips pressed into a thin line as the elevator dinged, signaling their arrival. It's not just about the training. It's about holding people accountable. Starting now, the elevator doors slid open, and they stepped into the bustling lobby. Greg was standing at the far end near the security desk, talking to another guard, his shoulders hunched and his face red with embarrassment. Simone caught sight of him, but quickly turned away, heading toward the cardiology department. Daniel followed, matching her determined pace. Back at the security desk, Greg shifted uncomfortably as Lisa Nguyen studied him. She had listened patiently as he vented his frustration about the meeting, but her disapproval was evident in the way her arms were crossed. You got off easy, Lisa finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Greg frowned, his frustration bubbling over. Easy? I'm on probation. Rachel practically called me a racist in front of everyone. Do you know how humiliating that was? Lisa raised an eyebrow. And how do you think they felt? Simone and Daniel Carter are two of the most respected doctors here. You treated them like criminals in front of half the lobby. That's worse than humiliation, Greg. Greg's face reddened further, but he didn't respond. Lisa leaned forward slightly. You need to think about why you made those assumptions. They didn't do anything wrong, but you treated them differently anyway. Why? Greg's mouth opened, then closed. He looked away, his hands tightening into fists. I was just doing my job, he muttered. Lisa sighed, her disappointment palpable. Maybe it's time to rethink what you think your job is. She stood, grabbing a clipboard. Rachel's right about one thing. This isn't just about you. It's about all of us. As Lisa walked away, Greg stared after her, his stomach twisting uncomfortably. Later that afternoon, Rachel sat at her desk, reviewing the agenda for the upcoming bias training. The meeting with Greg and the Carters weighed heavily on her mind. She prided herself on being a strong leader, but this incident had shaken her confidence. Her office door creaked open, and Maria Torres, a young nurse in her early 20s, peeked inside. Dr. Edwards, do you have a moment? Rachel gestured for her to come in. Of course, Maria. What's on your mind? Maria stepped in, her hands twisting nervously. I heard about what happened yesterday, with the Carters and Greg. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her curiosity piqued. Go on. Maria hesitated, then took a deep breath. I've had similar experiences here, not with Greg, but with some of the doctors and even patients. Sometimes they assume I'm just a cleaning lady because of my accent, Or they call me sweetie, like I'm not a professional. It makes me feel invisible. Rachel's heart sank as she listened. Maria, thank you for sharing that with me. I can't imagine how difficult it's been, but your voice is important. We need to hear these experiences if we're going to make real changes. Maria nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I just want to belong here, to feel like my work matters. Rachel offered a warm smile. Your work does matter, and so do you. I'm going to make sure that everyone at this hospital understands that. After Maria left, Rachel sat in silence, her mind racing. It was clear now that the issues at Brookfield General went deeper than one security guard's actions. She picked up her phone and dialed Simone. Simone, it's Rachel. I've been thinking about what you said earlier about accountability. Simone's voice was calm, but firm. What about it? You're right. This can't stop with Greg. I'd like you and Daniel to join me in designing a comprehensive inclusivity initiative for the hospital. Something that goes beyond training and actually addresses the culture here. There was a pause on the other end. You're asking us to help rebuild the system that failed us? Yes, Rachel said. Because your perspective is invaluable. And because I know you want to see real change just as much as I do. Simone hesitated, then sighed. I'll talk to Daniel. But Rachel, this isn't just a PR move. If we do this, it has to mean something. It will, Rachel promised. That evening, Simone and Daniel sat on their living room couch, the glow of a lamp casting warm light over the room. Their daughters were asleep upstairs, and the quiet gave them space to reflect. Rachel wants us to help design the inclusivity program, Simone said, sipping her tea. Daniel looked up from his tablet, his eyebrows raised. She wants us to do her job? Simone shook her head. She wants us to help her fix what's broken. And honestly, Daniel, I think we should. Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. We're already balancing so much. And this isn't our responsibility. Why should it fall on us to fix their mess? Because if we don't, who will? Simone asked, her voice soft but resolute. We've lived this. We know what needs to change. If we walk away, we're leaving the door open for the same thing to happen again. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're right. It feels like a lot. But if you're in, I'm in. Simone smiled faintly. Thank you. As they sat in the quiet of their home, a renewed sense of purpose settled over them. This wasn't just about making things right for themselves. It was about ensuring a better future for everyone who walked through the hospital's doors. The next day, Rachel called a meeting with the hospital's senior leadership team to outline her vision for the inclusivity initiative. As she spoke, her colleagues listened intently, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. This isn't going to be a one-off training session, Rachel said firmly. We're going to conduct listening sessions with staff, create mentorship programs for underrepresented employees, and establish an anonymous reporting system for bias and discrimination. One manager raised a hand. How are we going to pay for all this? Our budget is already stretched thin. Rachel met his gaze. We'll find the money. Because if we don't, the cost will be much greater, both financially and morally. There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Rachel felt a flicker of hope. Outside the conference room, Greg watched from a distance as staff moved through the halls, his probation weighing heavily on his shoulders. He thought about Lisa's words, about the way Simone and Daniel had stood their ground. For the first time, he wondered if he'd been wrong. The morning sunlight streamed through the wide windows of Brookfield General's cafeteria, casting a golden hue over the bustling space. At one corner table, Dr. Simone Carter and Dr. Daniel Carter sat with Rachel Edwards. The three leaned over papers and laptops, their conversation low but intense. We can't just focus on employees, Simone said, pointing to a note she had jotted down. Patients experience bias too. If they don't feel seen or respected, we fail before we even start. Rachel nodded. You're right. That's why I want these listening sessions to include patients as well. Their voices are just as important. Daniel sipped his coffee thoughtfully. This is ambitious, Rachel. Do you think the board will support it? They will if I frame it correctly, Rachel replied, her tone resolute. This isn't just about doing the right thing, it's about our reputation. Incidents like the one you experience can damage trust. Without trust, we lose patience. We lose funding. Daniel raised an eyebrow. So, we're appealing to their bottom line. Rachel gave a wry smile. If that's what it takes to get them on board, then yes. But that doesn't mean the change won't be real. Simone sat back, her arms crossed. I hope so, for everyone's sake. Elsewhere in the hospital, Greg Larson sat in the cramped security office, staring blankly at the incident report from the previous day. Lisa Nguyen stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. You've been quiet all morning, Lisa said, breaking the silence. Greg didn't look up, just try to keep my head down. Probation means I can't afford any mistakes. Lisa sighed and pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. Greg, keeping your head down won't fix anything. If you want to move forward, you need to figure out why this happened in the first place. Greg looked up, his brow furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means you can't just chalk this up to a bad day, Lisa said, her voice calm but firm. Think about it. Why did you single out the Carters? They had badges. They were acting professionally, but you still saw them as a threat. Greg's jaw tightened. I already told you I was just doing my job. Were you? Lisa pressed. Or were you doing what you thought your job was, based on assumptions you've never questioned? Greg's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of her words sinking in. I don't know, he admitted after a long pause. Lisa softened, her tone becoming more encouraging. It's not too late to figure it out. The training Rachel's planning, it's a chance for all of us to do better. That includes you. Greg didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted. The first listening session took place in one of the hospital's conference rooms. Chairs were arranged in a circle, creating a space meant to encourage open dialogue. The participants included doctors, nurses, administrative staff, and a few patients who had volunteered to share their experiences. Simone and Daniel sat beside Rachel, observing quietly as the session began. Maria Torres, the young nurse who had spoken to Rachel earlier, was the first to share. I love working here, Maria began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. But there are times when I feel like I have to work twice as hard to prove myself. Patients assume I'm not a real nurse because of my accent. Some of my coworkers talk over me in meetings. It's exhausting. The room was silent as Maria spoke, her vulnerability setting the tone for the discussion. A middle-aged doctor across the circle cleared his throat. I think we've all had moments where we've felt unappreciated or overlooked, he said cautiously. Simone's gaze sharpened. With respect, Dr. Howell, there's a difference between feeling overlooked and being consistently marginalized because of your identity. Dr. Howell looked uncomfortable, but nodded. You're right. I didn't mean to downplay anyone's experience. I just think we all have blind spots. That's why we're here, Rachel interjected. To address those blind spots and figure out how we can do better. Greg sat toward the back of the room, his presence understated but not unnoticed. He had come reluctantly, unsure of what he could contribute. But as he listened to Maria and the others share their stories, a sense of unease settled over him. When Rachel invited anyone else to speak, Greg hesitated before raising his hand. All eyes turned to him, and he felt his pulse quicken. I want to say something, Greg began, his voice uncertain. I've been working here for over 10 years, and I thought I was good at my job. I thought I was keeping people safe. But after what happened with the Carters, he trailed off, swallowing hard. I realized I might have been wrong. I didn't see them for who they were. I just saw what I assumed. The room was silent for a moment before Simone spoke. Thank you for saying that, Greg. Acknowledging it is the first step. Greg nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I know I have a lot to learn, but I want to do better. As the session ended, Simone and Daniel lingered in the hallway, reflecting on what they had heard. That was unexpected, Daniel said. Simone nodded. Greg admitting he was wrong? I didn't see that coming. Maybe Rachel's plan is working, Daniel said with a small smile. Simone didn't respond immediately. She glanced back into the conference room, where Rachel was thanking the participants. It's a start, she said finally. Over the next few days, the impact of the listening sessions began to ripple through the hospital. Conversations about bias and inclusivity moved from the conference room into break rooms and hallways. Staff members who had once avoided these topics now found themselves reflecting on their actions and assumptions. Even Greg, who had spent years believing he was above reproach, began to see his role differently. One afternoon, he encountered an elderly black janitor named Mr. Harold struggling with a heavy cart of cleaning supplies. "Let me help you with that," Greg said, stepping forward. Mr. Harold looked up, his expression wary but grateful. "Thank you, son. I don't usually get offers like that." As they walked together, Harold shared stories of his time at the hospital, stories of kindness, struggle, and resilience. By the time they parted ways, Greg felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced before. At the end of the week, Rachel gathered her leadership team to review the progress made so far. The mood in the room was cautious but optimistic. "The feedback from the listening sessions has been overwhelmingly positive," Rachel reported. "But this is just the beginning. We need to keep the momentum going." Simone and Daniel, who had been invited to join the meeting, nodded in agreement. "Changing a culture takes time," Simone said. "But I'm starting to believe it's possible." Rachel smiled. "It is, because people like you are holding us accountable." That evening, Simone and Daniel returned home, their daughters greeting them with hugs and laughter. As they sat together at the dinner table, Simone felt a sense of hope she hadn't expected. "What's on your mind?" Daniel asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Simone smiled softly. "I think we're finally starting to see real change. And it feels good." Daniel raised his glass of water. "To perseverance." Simone clinked her glass against his. "And to hope." The following week began with a sense of cautious optimism at Brookfield General Hospital. Staff members who had participated in the listening sessions carried those conversations into their daily routines, prompting moments of introspection and change. However, for Greg Larson, the weight of accountability lingered like an uncomfortable shadow. Seated at his desk in the security office, Greg glanced over a memo from Rachel Edwards outlining the next round of bias training sessions. The language was straightforward, emphasizing growth over punishment, but to Greg, it felt like a personal indictment. He tossed the paper onto the desk with a sigh and leaned back in his chair. Lisa Nguyen walked in, her arms full of incident reports. "You okay?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. Greg hesitated before responding. "I don't know, Lisa. Feels like I've been painted as the villain here. It's like no one cares about all the times I've done my job, right? Only the one time I screwed up." Lisa set the reports down and pulled up a chair. "Greg, this isn't about erasing everything you've done right. It's about fixing the one thing you got wrong. You can either let it define you or use it to grow. The choice is yours." Her words hung in the air, leaving Greg to grapple with their truth. Meanwhile, Simone Carter found herself deep in preparation for her role on the Inclusivity Committee. In her office, she reviewed the notes from the listening sessions, her pen flying across the pages of her notebook. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her focus. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from Rachel. "Can you come to my office? I'd like to discuss next steps." Simone grabbed her notebook and headed upstairs, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Rachel's office was bright and organized, but the tension in the room was palpable. Simone noticed the furrow in Rachel's brow as she gestured for her to sit. "We've made some progress," Rachel began, "but not everyone is on board. I'm hearing pushback from a few department heads who think this initiative is unnecessary or overly critical." Simone's jaw tightened. "Overly critical? Of what?" "The truth." Rachel sighed. "Exactly. But this resistance is real, and we need a strategy to address it. I'm hoping the Inclusivity Committee can help create a plan that's both effective and sustainable." Simone nodded, her determination hardening. "We'll make it work. But Rachel, we can't water this down to make people comfortable. Real change isn't comfortable." Rachel smiled faintly. "I couldn't agree more." Later that afternoon, Daniel Carter stood in the operating room, finishing a complex neurosurgery procedure. His team worked seamlessly beside him, the tension of the case dissolving as they secured the final sutures. "Good work, everyone," Daniel said, his voice calm but warm. Another life saved. As the team began cleaning up, one of the nurses, a middle-aged man named Brian, hesitated before approaching Daniel. "Dr. Carter, can I ask you something?" Brian said, his tone cautious. "Of course," Daniel replied, pulling off his gloves. Brian shifted nervously. I heard about what happened with security last week. I just wanted to say, I think it's really brave of you and Dr. Carter to speak up. A lot of us have seen things like that happen, but most people stay quiet. Daniel paused, surprised by Brian's candor. Thank you, Brian. It wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. Brian nodded. I guess I just wanted to let you know that some of us are paying attention. And we're with you. Daniel smiled, clapping Brian on the shoulder. That means more than you know. Meanwhile, Greg attended his first bias training session. The room was filled with staff from various departments, nurses, administrative assistants, and other security guards. At the front of the room stood Dr. Emily Harper, a diversity and inclusion specialist with a calm yet commanding presence. This isn't about blaming or shaming, Dr. Harper began. It's about understanding how our experiences shape our perceptions and how those perceptions can impact the people around us. Greg sat stiffly in his chair, feeling the weight of the room's collective gaze. He expected a lecture, but instead, Dr. Harper asked a question that caught him off guard. Have you ever made an assumption about someone that turned out to be wrong? The room was silent for a moment before a nurse raised her hand. I have, she admitted. A few months ago, I assumed a patient couldn't afford their medication based on how they were dressed. I was wrong, and it made me realize how much I rely on stereotypes without even noticing. Greg's stomach tightened as he listened, her words hitting uncomfortably close to home. He thought about Simone and Daniel, how confident they had looked, how sure he had been that they didn't belong. For the first time, Greg raised his hand. When I stopped the Carters in the lobby, I thought I was doing the right thing, he began, his voice hesitant. But looking back, I see that I wasn't treating them the same way I would have treated anyone else. I assumed things I shouldn't have, and I regret that. Dr. Harper nodded, her expression kind. Acknowledging our biases is hard, but it's also the first step toward changing them. Thank you for sharing, Greg. As the session continued, Greg found himself listening more intently than he expected. Stories from his co-workers painted a picture of a workplace where small, thoughtless actions had big, lasting impacts. For the first time, Greg began to understand the depth of the harm he had caused. That evening, Simone and Daniel sat in their living room, their daughters asleep upstairs. Simone scrolled through the feedback from the listening sessions on her laptop while Daniel sipped tea beside her. Rachel's getting pushback from some of the department heads, Simone said, not looking up. Daniel frowned. Why? Are they worried about the hospital's image? Probably, Simone replied. Or maybe they're just afraid of change. Daniel leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. Change scares people. But if Greg can admit he was wrong, maybe there's hope for the rest of them. Simone glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. You think Greg's changing? I think he's starting to, Daniel said. Lisa told me he's been helping the janitorial staff lately. No complaints, no grumbling, just doing what needs to be done. Simone considered this, a small smile tugging at her lips. Well, if Greg Larson can grow, maybe there's hope for all of us. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the house settling over them like a blanket. This is going to take time, Daniel said finally. But I think we're heading in the right direction. Simone reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. We are, and we're not stopping until we get there. The crisp morning air filled Brookfield General Hospital with a renewed sense of energy. For weeks, the listening sessions and training programs had encouraged conversations among the staff, but this morning, something felt different. It was subtle, an air of mutual respect among employees, small gestures of kindness, and moments of accountability where silence once reigned. Dr. Simone Carter, clipboard in hand, walked briskly toward the cardiology department. Her thoughts lingered on the feedback she'd reviewed the night before. While some staff expressed genuine enthusiasm for the hospital's new inclusivity initiatives, others remained skeptical. Simone entered the staff lounge and found Maria Torres chatting with a colleague over coffee. Maria looked up and waved, her eyes bright with recognition. Dr. Carter, Maria said, standing up slightly, I wanted to thank you for everything you said during the listening sessions. It gave me the courage to share my own story. Simone smiled warmly. I'm glad you spoke up, Maria. Your voice matters, and sharing your experiences helps all of us learn. Maria nodded, but her voice dropped to a quieter tone. It's just hard sometimes. Some of the older nurses still look at me like I don't belong. They don't say it outright, but I can feel it. Simone set down her clipboard, her expression softening. Change is hard, Maria, especially for people who are used to doing things a certain way. But don't let that stop you from being the incredible nurse you are. If they don't see your worth now, they will eventually. Maria smiled, her confidence bolstered by Simone's words. In the security office, Greg Larson reviewed the day's assignments. His probation had left him hyper-aware of his every action, but it also gave him time to reflect. The training sessions had stirred something in him, a discomfort he couldn't ignore. Lisa Nguyen walked in, her usual calm demeanor in place. She glanced at Greg, who seemed lost in thought. "Earth to Greg," Lisa said, waving a hand in front of him. Greg snapped out of his daze, chuckling awkwardly. Just thinking." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "About?" Greg hesitated, then said, "You ever think about all the little decisions we make during a shift? Like how we decide who to approach, who to question, who to let through without a second glance?" Lisa crossed her arms, her curiosity piqued. "Ido, why?" Greg sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because I'm starting to realize how much of it isn't based on logic. It's based on assumptions I didn't even know I had. And I don't like it." Lisa's expression softened. "That's a good thing, Greg. It means you're starting to see what needs to change." Greg nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I am." In the surgical wing, Dr. Daniel Carter prepared for another long day of procedures. As he reviewed his schedule, a familiar face appeared at the door. Brian, the nurse who had spoken to him after surgery the previous week. "Dr. Carter," Brian said, stepping into the room. "Do you have a minute?" Daniel set down the chart he was holding. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Brian shifted his weight nervously. "It's about the new initiatives. I've been thinking about what you and Dr. Carter said during the sessions. About how bias doesn't just hurt individuals, it hurts everyone." Daniel nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I realized I've been part of the problem," Brian admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "There's this nurse in my department, Maria. She's great, but I've caught myself dismissing her ideas in meetings without even realizing it. I want to do better, but I'm not sure how." Daniel regarded Brian with a mixture of respect and understanding. "The fact that you recognize it is a good start. Change doesn't happen overnight, but being aware of your actions and being willing to listen, that's how it begins." Brian exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thanks, Dr. Carter. I appreciate that." That afternoon, Rachel Edwards convened a committee meeting to review the progress of the inclusivity initiatives. Simone and Daniel sat at the table alongside other staff representatives, including Maria and Greg. "Thank you all for coming," Rachel began, her tone calm but focused. "We've made good progress so far, but there's still a long way to go. Today, I want to talk about next steps." Simone leaned forward, her notebook open. "One thing I've noticed is that while the training sessions are making an impact, we need to address the hiring pipeline. If leadership doesn't reflect the diversity of our staff and patients, we're not solving the root problem." Rachel nodded. "That's an excellent point. What do you suggest?" "Mentorship programs," Simone said. "Identify talented staff from underrepresented backgrounds and prepare them for leadership roles. Pair them with experienced mentors who can help them navigate the system." Maria raised her hand tentatively. "Can I say something?" "Of course," Rachel said, smiling. "I think mentorship would be amazing," Maria said. "But it can't just be about climbing the ladder. It should also be about creating a culture where everyone feels valued, no matter their role." Greg, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I agree with Maria, and I'd like to volunteer to mentor new security hires. I've made mistakes, but maybe sharing what I've learned can help someone else avoid them." The room fell quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed Greg's unexpected offer. Simone regarded him thoughtfully. "That's a good idea, Greg, and it shows real growth." Greg met her gaze, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thanks, Dr. Carter. I'm trying." Rachel's smile widened. "This is exactly the kind of collaboration we need. Let's work together to make these ideas a reality." As the meeting adjourned, Simone and Daniel walked toward the parking lot together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. You know, Daniel said, his tone light, I think Greg might actually be turning over a new leaf. Simone smirked. It's about time. But I'll admit, I'm impressed. He's stepping up. Daniel chuckled. Who would have thought? Greg Larson, Mentor of the Year. Simone laughed softly. Stranger things have happened. As they reached their car, Simone paused, looking out at the horizon. You think this is going to last? Daniel leaned against the car, his expression thoughtful. I think it's a start. And sometimes, that's enough. Simone nodded, her resolve strengthening. Then let's keep building. Back in the hospital, Greg lingered in the security office, his thoughts swirling. The training sessions had opened his eyes, but it was the people, their stories, their resilience that truly moved him. As he locked up for the night, he noticed Mr. Harold, the janitor he had helped the week before, pushing a cart down the hall. Hey, Harold, Greg called out. Mr. Harold turned, his face lighting up with a warm smile. Evening, Greg. Need a hand? Greg asked, walking over. Harold chuckled. You're getting a reputation for being helpful these days. What's gotten into you? Greg shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. Just trying to do better. Harold patted him on the shoulder. Well, keep it up. The world needs more of that. As Greg pushed the cart alongside Harold, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. Change wasn't easy, but it was happening one small act at a time. Brookfield General hummed with its usual rhythm the next morning, but for Greg Larson, the day felt different. The training sessions, the committee discussions, and the quiet conversations he had shared with colleagues were starting to weigh on him in unexpected ways. He was no longer just doing his job, he was thinking about how he did it and why it mattered. After finishing his rounds in the lobby, Greg found himself standing by the entrance, watching people come and go. Patients in wheelchairs, doctors in scrubs, and families with anxious eyes passed through the revolving doors, each carrying their own stories. Lisa Nguyen approached, her clipboard tucked under one arm. You look deep in thought, she remarked. Greg gave her a faint smile. Just noticing things. Lisa tilted her head. Noticing what? Greg gestured toward a woman struggling to maneuver a stroller and a bag of medical supplies. Her toddler tugged impatiently at her sleeve, whining softly. Stuff like that, he said. Before Lisa could respond, Greg walked over to the woman. Ma'am, can I help you with that? The woman hesitated, her face showing both surprise and relief. Oh, thank you. That would be wonderful. Greg took the bag of supplies and walked beside her to the elevator, where he pressed the button for her floor. Have a good day, he said as she stepped inside, her gratitude evident in her smile. Lisa watched the interaction from afar, a small smile of her own forming. Greg was changing slowly but surely. Meanwhile, Simone Carter sat in her office, reviewing the latest Inclusivity Committee report. The mentorship program was beginning to take shape, and plans for more listening sessions were underway. Yet despite the progress, Simone felt a lingering unease. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Rachel Edwards stepped inside, holding a folder under her arm. Got a minute? Rachel asked. Simone nodded. Disting vorher zusieht. Rachel placed the folder on the desk. I wanted to share something with you. It's feedback from the first round of training sessions. Thought you'd want to see it. Simone opened the folder and scanned the pages. Comments ranged from cautiously optimistic to outright enthusiastic. One in particular caught her eye. Hearing stories from my colleagues opened my eyes to how much I've overlooked. I didn't realize how much harm small actions or inactions can cause. I want to do better. Simone looked up, her expression softening. This is encouraging. Rachel smiled. It is. And it's thanks to you and Daniel for sharing your story. People are listening, Simone. Simone leaned back in her chair, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the confrontation in the lobby weeks ago. It's still hard to believe Greg Larson is part of this change. Rachel chuckled. It surprised me too. But sometimes, the people who resist change the most have the most to learn. That afternoon, Daniel Carter stood in the operating room, preparing for another procedure. His team worked efficiently around him, their movements precise and coordinated. As Daniel reviewed the patient's chart, Brian, the nurse who had confided in him earlier, approached with a question. Dr. Carter, I was wondering, would it be okay if I observed the post-op briefing? I want to understand more about how you approach complex cases. Daniel looked up, his expression warm. Of course, Brian. Observing is one of the best ways to learn. Brian smiled, gratitude evident in his eyes. Thank you. I appreciate that. Daniel watched as Brian returned to his station, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. These small moments mentoring, encouraging, and building trust were the seeds of a stronger, more inclusive team. In another part of the hospital, Maria Torres was leading a small group of nurses in a breakout discussion on cultural competence. The session was informal, but the conversations were honest and raw. I used to think my accent was something to hide, Maria said, her voice steady but emotional. But now, I see it as part of who I am. Patients connect with me because I speak to them in ways they understand. That's not a weakness, it's a strength. One of the nurses, a young man named Jared, nodded. I've caught myself making assumptions about patients before. I didn't even realize I was doing it. Hearing your story makes me want to do better. Maria smiled, her confidence growing with every word of support. Later that evening, Greg attended another bias training session. This time, Dr. Emily Harper posed a challenging question to the group. What does empathy look like in action? The room fell silent as participants considered the question. Greg raised his hand hesitantly. I think empathy means seeing people for who they really are, not who you assume they are. It means asking yourself, how would I want to be treated in their shoes? Dr. Harper nodded, her expression encouraging. That's a great insight, Greg. Empathy isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. And it takes effort, but it's worth it. Greg's words lingered in the minds of his co-workers as the session continued, sparking conversations about how empathy could transform their workplace. By the time Greg left the hospital that night, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. As he walked to his car, he noticed Mr. Harold locking up the janitorial supply closet. Evening, Harold, Greg called out. Harold looked up and smiled. Evening, Greg. How's it going? Greg hesitated, then said, Better. A lot better. Harold chuckled, his tone warm. That's good to hear. You keep walking that path, son. You're on the right track. As Greg drove home, Harold's words echoed in his mind. The path ahead was long, but for the first time, Greg felt he was walking it with purpose. Across town, Simone and Daniel sat in their living room, their daughters asleep upstairs. Simone reviewed the day's notes while Daniel flipped through a medical journal. Rachel showed me the training feedback today, Simone said, breaking the comfortable silence. Daniel glanced up. And it's working, Simone said, a hint of a smile on her lips. People are starting to get it. Daniel leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Even Greg. Simone nodded. Even Greg. They sat quietly for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling over them. Do you think it's enough? Daniel asked finally. Simone closed her notebook and looked at him, her gaze steady. It's a start, and sometimes that's all we need. The hospital buzzed with its usual flurry of activity as the sun climbed higher in the sky. For Greg Larson, the day began with the now familiar routine of patrolling the lobby and hallways, his interactions with staff and visitors markedly different from just a few weeks ago. Instead of quick judgments or stiff exchanges, Greg had begun pausing to ask patients if they needed help, engaging with staff more thoughtfully, and greeting visitors with warmth. He had even started a small but meaningful habit of thanking each janitor he passed, a simple acknowledgement that seemed to brighten their day. One such moment came that morning as Greg encountered Maria Torres near the cafeteria. Maria was carrying a tray of coffee cups, clearly meant for her colleagues. Need a hand with that? Greg asked, stepping toward her. Maria hesitated, then smiled. Thanks, but I've got it. Appreciate the offer, though. Greg nodded. No problem. How's the mentorship program coming along? Maria tilted her head, surprised by the question. It's going well, actually. A lot of people are starting to open up about things they used to keep quiet. That's good to hear, Greg said, sincerity in his voice. Keep at it. Maria watched him as he walked away, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. She had been skeptical of Greg's transformation at first, but now she wondered if the change might actually be genuine. Simone Carter spent her morning in back-to-back meetings, her notebook filling with ideas for the hospital's mentorship and inclusivity programs. The progress was encouraging, But Simone knew there was still work to be done. As she made her way toward the cafeteria for a quick lunch, she was stopped by a familiar voice. "Dr. Carter?" Simone turned to see Brian, the nurse Daniel had been mentoring, standing in the hallway. "Yes, Brian," she said, adjusting the strap of her bag. Brian's expression was earnest. "I just wanted to thank you and Dr. Carter for everything you've been doing. The mentorship program has already made a difference for me, and I think for a lot of us." Simone smiled warmly. "That's good to hear, Brian. But the credit belongs to people like you, who are willing to engage and grow." Brian nodded, his shoulders straightening slightly. "Still, it means a lot to have leaders like you setting the tone." As Simone walked away, she felt a spark of hope. The seeds they had planted were starting to take root, and the culture of the hospital was shifting in a tangible way. Across the hospital, Rachel Edwards sat in her office, reviewing the latest feedback from staff and patients. A knock at the door interrupted her focus, and she looked up to see Greg standing in the doorway. "Greg," Rachel said, motioning for him to come in. "What can I do for you?" Greg stepped inside, his expression a mix of nervousness and resolve. "I wanted to talk about the mentorship program," he said, sitting across from her. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I've been thinking," Greg began, "about how much I've learned over the past few weeks. And I want to do more. I know I can't undo what happened, but maybe I can help other security staff avoid making the same mistakes I did." Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You're offering to mentor new hires?" Greg nodded. "Yeah, I want to share what I've learned about bias, about empathy, about doing the job right." A small smile tugged at the corners of Rachel's mouth. "That's a bold step, Greg, but it's exactly the kind of leadership we need. Let's make it happen." In the operating room, Daniel Carter finished another successful surgery. As his team cleaned up and prepared for the next case, he lingered with Brian, discussing the complexities of the procedure. "You handled yourself well today," Daniel said, nodding toward Brian. Brian smiled, pride evident in his face. "Thanks, Dr. Carter. I'm learning a lot from these post-ops debriefs." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Keep asking questions. That's how you get better." As Brian returned to his duties, Daniel felt a sense of fulfillment. Mentorship wasn't just about teaching skills, it was about building confidence and trust. The hospital leadership team met that afternoon to finalize plans for the upcoming panel discussion. Simone and Daniel sat beside Rachel, their notebooks open and pens poised. "We'll have a mix of staff and patients on the panel," Rachel explained. "The goal is to showcase how far we've come and how far we still have to go." Simone nodded. "It's important that the discussion feels authentic, not rehearsed. People need to see the real challenges and the real progress." Daniel added, "And we should be prepared for tough questions. Not everyone's going to believe in the changes right away." Rachel smiled. "That's why we have you two on the team. Your honesty sets the tone." As the meeting concluded, the group felt a shared sense of purpose. The panel discussion would be a milestone, a chance to demonstrate their commitment to change. That evening, Greg walked through the hospital's quieter wings, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. He passed by the janitorial closet and saw Mr. Harold cleaning a cart. "Evening, Harold," Greg said, stepping closer. Harold looked up, his expression lighting up with recognition. "Evening, Greg. How's the day treating you?" Greg shrugged. "Not bad. How about you?" Harold chuckled. Same old, but it's nice to see you doing your rounds with a smile these days." Greg laughed softly. "I'm trying, Harold. One step at a time." Harold nodded, his tone thoughtful. "That's all anyone can do. And let me tell you something, those small steps you're taking, they matter more than you know." As Greg walked away, Harold's words stayed with him. Small steps. That was how change happened. At home, Simone and Daniel sat in their living room, the quiet of the evening a welcome reprieve from the day's busyness. Rachel said Greg's volunteering to mentor new security hires, Simone said, glancing up from her notebook. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Really? That's surprising." Simone nodded. "It is, but it's also proof that people can change when they're given the chance." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe this is all working after all." Simone closed her notebook and leaned back, a sense of contentment settling over her. "It's not perfect, but it's progress. And that's worth something." Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Here's to progress. Simone smiled, her heart lightened by the thought. The following week brought a flurry of preparations at Brookfield General as the hospital neared its first inclusivity panel discussion. Rachel Edwards worked tirelessly to ensure the event would showcase the progress the hospital had made while acknowledging the road still ahead. Simone and Daniel Carter, seated at the heart of these efforts, prepared to share their story once again, but this time, with a larger audience of staff and patients. In the days leading up to the panel, Greg Larson found himself facing new challenges. As part of his probation, he had started mentoring new security hires, a role he initially approached with reluctance. Yet as he guided the younger guards through training drills and policy reviews, Greg discovered a surprising sense of purpose. One of his ments, a young man named Sean, looked up to Greg with eager curiosity. Sean was fresh out of the academy and full of questions, his enthusiasm reminiscent of Greg's early days. "Why do we spend so much time on bias training?" Sean asked during a quiet moment in their shift. "Shouldn't we just focus on securing the hospital?" Greg hesitated, caught off guard by the bluntness of the question. He looked at Sean, seeing himself from a few years ago confident, but blind to the complexities of his role. "Because security isn't just about keeping people out," Greg said finally. "It's about making sure everyone feels safe. And if we're not careful, we can end up being the reason they don't." Sean frowned, his brows furrowing. "You mean like profiling people?" Greg nodded. "Exactly. I made that mistake once. It hurt people who didn't deserve it, and it made me question everything I thought I knew about this job. Bias training helps us see those blind spots before they become problems." Sean considered this, his respect for Greg deepening. "That makes sense. Thanks for explaining." Greg nodded, though he couldn't help but think how long it had taken him to learn the same lesson. Simone Carter spent her morning reviewing the agenda for the panel discussion. Her office was quiet except for the soft tapping of her pen against her desk. Though she had spoken at countless conferences and medical events, this felt different. There was a knock at the door, and Maria Torres stepped inside, holding a clipboard. "Dr. Carter," Maria said, her voice steady but nervous. "Do you have a moment?" Simone smiled warmly. "Of course, Maria. What's on your mind?" Maria hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for all of us. I've seen changes I didn't think were possible. People are starting to listen. They're treating each other differently." Simone set down her pen, her gaze softening. "Thank you, Maria. That means a lot to hear. But this isn't just my work, it's all of us. Every story you've shared, every idea you've brought forward, has made a difference." Maria nodded, her confidence bolstered by Simone's words. "I just hope it lasts." Simone leaned forward slightly. "It will. Change isn't easy, but once the foundation is strong, it's hard to undo. And we're building something strong." Maria smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. The day of the panel discussion arrived, and the hospital's conference hall was transformed into a welcoming space. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where microphones and a modest backdrop displayed the words, "Moving forward, building trust and inclusion together." Simone and Daniel arrived early, greeted by Rachel and a few other panel participants. Among them were Maria, Greg, and Brian, each representing different facets of the hospital's evolving culture. As the audience trickled in, a mix of anticipation and nervous energy filled the room. Employees, patients, and community members settled into their seats, whispering to one another about what to expect. Rachel opened the event with a brief introduction, her voice calm but resolute. "Thank you all for being here today. This panel represents more than just a discussion. It's a commitment to growth, accountability, and a culture where everyone feels valued." She turned to Simone and Daniel. "We'll begin with Doctors Simone and Daniel Carter, whose courage and honesty have been at the heart of these efforts." Simone leaned into the microphone, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "When Daniel and I walked into this hospital weeks ago, we were treated not as the professionals we've spent our lives becoming, but as intruders. It wasn't the first time we've experienced something like this, but it was one of the most public and painful instances." Daniel picked up where she left off, his tone more direct. "What happened to us wasn't just about one person's actions. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a culture that tolerates assumptions and biases because they've always been there. But we're here today because we believe that can change. The room fell silent, the weight of their words sinking in. Greg was the next to speak, his voice tinged with humility. I was that person, the one who made those assumptions. I thought I was just doing my job, but I was wrong. I caused harm, and I've spent every day since trying to learn from it. He glanced at Simone and Daniel, his voice steady but earnest. I'm grateful for the second chance I've been given, and I hope my actions now can show that change is possible, even when it starts from a place of failure. Maria followed, sharing her perspective as a nurse navigating bias in patient care. Brian added his voice, describing how mentorship and openness had helped him recognize his own blind spots. As the discussion unfolded, the audience listened intently. Questions were invited, and a few staff members stood to share their own experiences, some of pain, others of unexpected kindness and growth. By the end of the event, the room felt different. The walls that had once divided staff and patients, doctors and security, began to feel less insurmountable. Rachel closed the discussion with a pledge. This is just the beginning. We are committed to building a hospital where everyone, staff, patients, and visitors alike, feels seen, respected, and valued. Thank you for joining us on this journey. The audience erupted into applause, a mixture of respect and hope filling the air. That evening, Simone and Daniel sat in their living room, the glow of the day still lingering. Their daughters were asleep upstairs, and the quiet gave them space to reflect. That felt different, Daniel said, swirling his tea. Simone nodded, her expression thoughtful. It did. I think people are starting to believe in this. Really believe. Daniel smiled faintly. Even Greg. Who would have thought? Simone chuckled softly. Change surprises you. But it's real, and it's worth fighting for. As they sat in the stillness of their home, they knew the journey wasn't over. But for the first time, the path ahead felt clear and full of possibility. The panel discussion marked a turning point at Brookfield General Hospital. In the days that followed, conversations about bias, inclusion, and accountability echoed through its halls. Staff members who once avoided these topics now found themselves engaging in open dialogue, challenging assumptions, and reflecting on their own actions. For Dr. Simone Carter and Dr. Daniel Carter, the aftermath of the event brought a sense of cautious hope. Yet they knew better than to rest on progress that was still fragile. One crisp morning, Simone arrived at the hospital early, her coffee steaming in her hand as she walked through the nearly empty lobby. To her surprise, Greg Larson stood at the security desk, reviewing paperwork. "Greg," Simone said, her tone warm but curious. "You're here early." Greg glanced up, startled but quickly recovering. "Morning, Dr. Carter. Yeah, I've been coming in early to go over the new mentorship materials. Thought I'd get a head start before my shift." Simone tilted her head, impressed. "That's good to hear. How's it going with the new hires?" Greg offered a small smile. "It's different, but in a good way. Sean's got a lot of potential, and mentoring him is helping me see the job and myself differently." Simone nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Keep at it, Greg. You're on the right track." As she walked away, Greg felt a sense of pride he hadn't expected. Her words carried weight, a reminder that the effort he was making mattered not just to him, but to the people around him. In the surgical wing, Daniel Carter prepared for a particularly complex neurosurgery. His team moved with precision as they set up the operating room, but the atmosphere felt lighter than usual. Brian, the nurse Daniel had been mentoring, approached with a clipboard. "Dr. Carter, I wanted to check something about the procedure," he said, his tone confident yet deferential. Daniel reviewed the notes and nodded. "Good catch, Brian. Let's adjust the prep accordingly." Brian beamed, his pride evident. "Thank you, sir." After the surgery, as Daniel and his team debriefed, Brian stayed behind to ask questions, delving deeper into the nuances of the procedure. Daniel encouraged his curiosity, knowing that mentorship wasn't just about sharing knowledge, it was about inspiring growth. Meanwhile, Rachel Edwards convened another inclusivity committee meeting, this time to discuss the next phase of the hospital's cultural shift. Simone, Daniel, Maria, and Greg all sat at the table, joined by other representatives from various departments. First, I want to thank everyone for their contributions to the panel discussion, Rachel began. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, both from staff and patients. Maria chimed in. I've had patients tell me they've noticed the difference not just in how they're treated, but in the atmosphere of the hospital. That's good to hear, Simone said. But we can't stop here. We need to make sure this momentum lasts. Rachel nodded. Agreed. That's why I'm proposing a quarterly review process for all departments. It'll help us track progress and identify areas where we still need improvement. Greg cleared his throat, drawing the group's attention. If I may, he said, his tone careful but confident, I'd like to suggest adding a peer feedback system. Sometimes we don't see our own blind spots, but our coworkers do. It could help us stay accountable. Simone raised an eyebrow, impressed. That's an excellent idea, Greg. Rachel smiled. I couldn't agree more. Let's include that in the proposal. That evening, Simone and Daniel returned home, their daughters eagerly greeting them at the door. Layla, the younger of the two, held up a colorful drawing. Look, Mommy! Daddy, she exclaimed. I made a picture of you helping people. Simone crouched down to examine the drawing, her heart swelling. The image showed two stick-figure doctors with wide smiles, surrounded by patients holding flowers. It's beautiful, Layla, Simone said, hugging her daughter tightly. Daniel chuckled. You made us look good, sweetheart. As they sat together at the dinner table, Simone and Daniel reflected on how far they had come not just in their careers, but in the journey to make Brookfield General a better place for everyone. You think we've done enough? Daniel asked, his tone thoughtful. Simone looked at him, her expression resolute. We've done enough to start. But the work doesn't end here. It never does. Daniel nodded, raising his glass of water. To starting, and to everything that comes next. Simone clinked her glass against his, a sense of quiet determination settling over them. At the hospital, Greg locked up for the night, his probation officially over. As he walked toward the exit, he passed Mr. Harold, who was wiping down a set of counters in the lobby. Evening, Greg, Harold said with a knowing smile. Greg paused, his keys jingling in his hand. Evening, Harold. How's it going? Harold chuckled. Same as always. But you? You're looking lighter these days. Greg laughed softly. I think I am. Thanks, Harold, for everything. Harold waved him off with a grin. Just keep doing what you're doing, son. You're making a difference. As Greg stepped into the cool night air, he took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with himself, his work, and the future he was helping to shape. The following week, Brookfield General launched its revamped inclusivity program, complete with mentorship initiatives, quarterly reviews, and the peer feedback system Greg had suggested. The hospital's leadership team worked tirelessly to ensure these changes became ingrained in the institution's culture. Rachel Edwards addressed the staff in a morning meeting, her voice filled with conviction. This isn't just about policies or training. It's about creating a space where everyone, regardless of their role, background, or experience, feels they belong. Thank you all for being part of this journey. Months later, the hospital's efforts became a model for other institutions. Simone and Daniel continued to mentor younger staff. Maria spearheaded patient outreach programs, and Greg became a trusted mentor for the security team. One busy Friday afternoon, Simone and Daniel crossed paths in the hospital's bustling lobby. Heading to surgery? Simone asked, smiling. Daniel nodded. And you? Another meeting? Simone sighed playfully. Always. As they parted ways, both felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had also been worth every step. Brookfield General had transformed not into a perfect place, but into a better one. The changes were visible in the way staff treated each other, the way patients were welcomed, and the way every corner of the hospital felt a little more human. It was a reminder that change didn't happen overnight. It was built slowly, piece by piece, by people willing to challenge themselves and each other. And as Simone, Daniel, and their colleagues continued their work, they knew that every act of kindness, every moment of accountability, and every step forward was shaping a legacy of trust, empathy, and hope. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories that remind us of the power of resilience, empathy, and kindness. Don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, and hit the like button to let us know you want more stories like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey.